It's really nice to be here. I haven't spoken to the NBWA for a number of years. A while ago I did, but I think it's probably a different board now, and having Judy here is really neat. We worked with Judy for years in the Bay, so it's special to be here again. And I also want to mention I'm going to co-present with my colleague Erica Spotswood at SFBI, who's a lead scientist there and an applied ecologist with a background in resilience and urban biodiversity, and really the lead on this study we'll be talking about. So it's going to be me, then her, then I'm going to close it. So we'll have a lively sequence there. And so we're going to introduce this term, which perhaps you're familiar with or not. The first word up here, re-oaking. In case anyone wondered if that's a real word. It sort of is. I don't know if it's in the Oxford English Dictionary yet, but maybe in a few years we're successful. So it's something that just sort of emerged from conversations, and it speaks to the legacy of oaks in California as this remarkable tree that provides sort of this pretty unique role. It's one of the few species, these few species of oaks that can occupy the open, hot, arid, dry, 6-month drought landscape and provide all of this structure, shade, food for the ecosystem, shade for people. This fundamental part of our landscape that is it's a legacy, but then it's also maybe really relevant for the future as we think about climate change, as we think about some of the things we care about ecologically as a region. So that's what we'll talk about here. So speaking to, and we just completed our first report on this idea. We're about to release it. Sorry, we didn't quite get it done for today, but we'll send the link around after. And that'll be the first report about how do you do reopening. So this is actually our first real public presentation on that work. So we're excited about the opportunity. Where's my, I've tested it, did this work? There we go, it's a little slow. So right, this is the report we're about to finish. So the legacy of oaks in California can be seen just in the names of places, right? Oakville, Oak Knoll. So those are both in Napa. City of Oakland, it's considered the land of oaks. City of Oakdale, Paso Robles, right? That's Robles is white oak. City of Thousand Oaks, it goes on and on. So this legacy embedded in the California landscape in the names, and this is partly because oaks are a big part of the beauty of the California landscape, and they still are. So this quote from Napa: "Magnificent oaks are a great secret. One great secret of Napa's beauty, the glory of the landscape scenery." And I'm going to draw a lot from the work in Napa that we did with the RCD and others in the Napa Historic Ecology Atlas. Napa is shaded by an oak grove not yet demolished, kind of a demoralizing quote, in 1860. The fields are scattered over them, grand oaks, which would be an ornament to any park. These are travelers. That's William Brewer, famous guy accompanying geology. They're really appreciated for their shade. This is a classic picture. You see the guy resting, bringing prunes down valley and stopping under the shade of a valley oak. Right, sitting here at the noontime rest. And I like how all the horses are huddled under the shade too. You think about how important these trees are out in the open plain. And there's an interesting legacy that is kind of forgotten about, which is that early on we really designed towns, and American, and before that Spanish settlement, and of course Native American, in concert with the trees. So this is Krug Winery. You can see it's pretty much integrated within the Valley Oak Grove. People really appreciated the trees. So St. Helena was nestled within the oaks. And essentially, they were the original architecture of these valleys, particularly valley oaks, which lived in the valleys where people tend to congregate and create settlements. And so they actually built into these places because that's where the shade came from. Otherwise, it was really extremely hot, as you know. This is a long-term resident of Napa that I interviewed a few years ago. He said everyone had an oak in their yard. You could walk around town under shade. That might be something we want in the future. When we think about, there was just a story that came out, a scientific publication saying how cities, on average across the world, go up in temperature by 8 degrees Celsius, or there's a range in there. But that can be modulated to some degree by the trees we plant, the vegetation we have. And so there's this effort to coexist with the trees. This is Oakland. Kind of amazing picture where they're putting in their roads, but they're still leaving the trees. The great trees of Oakland, because that was such a part of their legacy, part of their sense. They actually compare themselves to San Francisco as this barren wasteland, whereas they have these beautiful oaks. But of course, the decline did end up happening by the late 19th century and early 20th century, largely for orchards. Orchards did conflict with oaks being out there on the plain, also as cities got bigger and just sort of mowed over all the trees. So you go here in Oakland, downtown Oakland, this is 5th and Harrison, something like that. It's the same spot. Or here in Palo Alto, Park Yarrow Road to Oak Savannah. Same spot again. Well, the same spot, maybe not exactly the same angle, but the same spot. So we lost much of this legacy, and especially, it's interesting, especially some of the more rare oaks, like valley oaks, the ones that occupy the lowlands, because that's where agriculture and cities have been. But that's a really key species for the ecosystem, right? These oaks support, as Erica will talk about, an incredible number of species. So if there's one thing we can do to maintain the California ecosystem into the future, it's oaks as a foundation for so many species. But then it's also interesting, they're so drought tolerant. Much of what we've planted in cities or alongside roads, you see all the redwoods struggling with the drought. We planted a lot of trees. We grabbed a lot of trees from the East Coast because a lot of us like the color, like the maples, the pears, the cherries. Those are probably not the trees from the second half of the century in California. Ironically, these native trees, which continue south almost to Mexico, where it's a lot hotter, may be more appropriate and also more culturally relevant to our landscape. So we've studied this in a few different places, and the story is the same. You know, a dramatic decline at the turn of the century as orchards, agriculture expands, and then kind of a continued attrition in the 20th century of just sort of gradual loss. The bigger trees, you see that, there's big trees kept, they eventually die or are cut down, and then not much is being planted to replace them. But our idea is that that doesn't really have to happen, particularly because while there's actually plenty of room for these trees if we design it properly. So that's where I'll hand it over to Erica.
Okay, so Robin gave us a really nice background on sort of the history of the landscape transformation and the history of oaks in Napa and elsewhere in the state. But how do we move from reconstructing that history to how things are functioning now, and how do we build on that information to envision a future that is better than the present, to envision a future that reincorporates, that is ecologically resilient and reincorporates some of the ecosystem functionality that was there before large-scale landscape transformation. So this process of reconstructing history, assessing change over time, how things have changed from the past to the present, and then using that change to inform the future, and envision a more ecologically resilient future, is the process that we go through in the Resilient Landscapes program at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. So I'm going to use reoaking as sort of a model system to walk you through how we've done this in this Reoaking Silicon Valley report. So to start us off, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we mean by landscape resilience. So when we say landscape resilience, we're talking about landscapes that can support that biodiversity, that can persist and recover from disturbance, and can transform and shift as the climate is changing. And we all know the climate is shifting beneath our feet, and we're headed for a future that's different from the present. So this brings us to two important questions that we're really grappling with across a variety of different projects within the Reopening project as well. First is how can working landscapes in cities and agricultural areas and rangelands contribute to regional resilience. So we typically think about urban areas as the kind of the barren wastelands on the valley floor, and then in the hills we have conservation organizations that are trying to protect and conserve these areas that are adjacent to cities and adjacent to agriculture in the valley floor. But what would be better is if we could get those working landscapes to contribute to the regional resilience, so that what we were doing in cities and what we were doing in agriculture could buffer the activities of conservation groups in the hills that are surrounding our cities. So the second question is, can we make these activities that are more ecologically resilient that can benefit both people and biodiversity, so that we're building something that's good for both us and for biodiversity, wildlife, and resilience for the future. So this, going back to reopening Silicon Valley, this report, sort of we're thinking about all of these ideas within the report. So as Robin mentioned, we're focusing on Silicon Valley, but the reopening idea is really pretty broadly applicable because there are many cities across the state that lost oak woodlands over time. This is a story that's pretty common. And so we're assessing these ideas in Silicon Valley, but thinking more broadly about how we could apply them in other places. So the story that Robin told about the transformation and the loss of oak woodlands in Napa is also happens in Silicon Valley. So this is a map of Silicon Valley with the historical ecology layer on top that SFAI has developed. And what you can see is that there's a really large area of oak savanna and oak woodland on the valley floor, adjacent to the tidal marsh and the wet meadows. So sort of nestled in between the hills and the bay. And that's what this landscape looks like today. It's, as we all know, a very highly urbanized valley. And as I mentioned, this story is duplicated across Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the state. This is a common thing that has happened. And we also know that cities were designed with little attention to natural processes, and that creates an opportunity for us. That means we can do better. We can think in a more holistic way about how to integrate the different values that we want and the different things that we want to promote, including biodiversity and resilience. And cities as they currently are now will not necessarily weather the coming changes easily. So this is just 3 examples of what we mean by that. So, do I have a laser pointer? No. Okay. So on the left is stormwater runoff, so pavement doesn't capture rainwater really well, so the water is, it sounds like there's a lot of sanitary district people, so you guys already know this. Stormwater is an issue in cities. In the middle is a redwood. Redwoods are planted in a lot of places where they're not necessarily appropriate, and 4 years of drought has not been good for them. You can see how they're suffering in a lot of cities. And then on the right, cities across the country actually have the same set of sort of urban commensal species, the same set of pest species like pigeons and raccoons that are everywhere in cities. And cities could have more biodiversity that's possible. Okay, so what we've done with reopening Silicon Valley is building on the historical ecology that already had the reconstruction history piece. We asked how can we assess how this landscape has changed over time in order to envision better future landscapes. So focusing on the assessing change over time piece, what we did was to think about the ecological and physical processes of oak woodlands that supported biodiversity. And then we asked what can the urban landscape provide and what types of actions could make a difference. So some key characteristics of oak woodlands that are really important to think about is that these ecosystems have typically relatively low biodiversity. And when we say low, for example, they have many large trees, dead limbs, dead trees, leaf litter, and down logs would have all persisted with the tree. And that was really important for maintaining biodiversity. So the dead limbs could be excavated by cavity nesting birds. Other secondary cavity nesters could have then occupied those same holes that were created by woodpeckers. Those are 2 examples. The leaf litter encouraged nutrient cycling, creating islands of fertility under oak trees compared to the adjacent surrounding grassland. And then newts could have, the down logs provided cover for a variety of animals, including And so if you compare what's happened to the structure of the trees over time, We looked at a historic database of trees from the 1850s and compared it to 2 data sets of oak trees and street trees in the current landscape. And what we found is that if you look just at valley oaks and coast live oaks, the proportion of large trees over 32 inches, and large trees are really, really important for supporting wildlife biodiversity. The number of large trees is relatively similar for valley oak in the current and historical landscape. There's been a little bit of a decline in coast live oaks over time, but not nearly as dramatic as the decline in large trees more generally. So if you look across all species, there's been a really dramatic decline from 12% to 3% in the number of large trees on the landscape. And you can see that black bar on the left shows just how many really small trees there are today. So that's street tree data. So the trees on the edges of parkways and in medians are typically small. The forest structure was highly variable. There was a lot of other herbaceous vegetation. So the canopy cover ranged from 0 to 60%, depending on whether you were in oak woodland or an oak savanna. And there was a lot of vertical structure to this habitat. Now we looked at land cover in the current landscape, and what we found is that the herbaceous vegetation, sort of below that arrow, is now only 10% of the landscape, where it would have been 40 to 100% in the past. And that category has been replaced by buildings, impervious surfaces, and lawns. In the past, as I mentioned, the ecosystem would have been dominated by oaks, so they would have occupied about 80% of trees. And this is a typical diversity of a temperate forest. So you can look, we looked again at the tree database from the historical period and compared to the street tree database from today. And what you can see is that in the historical period, 80%, so all of the green, those are all native oaks. So the majority of the forest was oak trees. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what has replaced that among the street trees. This is an increase from around 20 species to around 400 species. That's a level of diversity characteristic of a tropical forest, like in Colorado Island in Panama, for example. And no one species is more than 8% of the total forest. So it's a dramatic change in species composition that's occurred over time. So to summarize, there are fewer larger trees. The structural features like dead limbs and downed logs are now missing. There's fewer oaks. There's been a dramatic increase in tree diversity, a loss of understory vegetation. But there's one hopeful note, which is that the canopy cover of the urban forest is consistent with the canopy cover, or it falls within the range of the canopy cover of a historical oak woodland. So canopy cover today is around 20%. That's within the range. It's less variable, but it at least means that we could integrate oaks back into the urban forest without a dramatic increase in the canopy cover, because the canopy covers are already similar. So how do we move from assessing these changes to envisioning future landscapes? So what we've done is to take all of this ecology and the change over time and an analysis of the current landscape to ask what types of actions could we do that would benefit biodiversity. And so one of these, I'm just going to walk through one example of these types of actions. So what we could do is we could center nodes of re-oaking around large trees. So we know that large trees are really important for biodiversity and for wildlife. We could, within these nodes, we could also create linear strips of herbaceous vegetation that help butterflies move through these habitats. We could place trees less than 500 feet apart so that they can pollinate each other. And that's really important because pollination is critical, as you might know, for the production of acorns. And acorns sustain a lot of wildlife. And then we can aim for at least 20 trees within these nodes, and that's a number that could support local populations of acorn woodpeckers and oak titmice and California sisters and other butterflies that specialize on oaks. So just a short list of some species that we think could benefit from this. So acorn woodpeckers and oak titmice, and then the two mournful dusky wing and the California sister are two specialist butterflies that really need oak woodlands. And there's this beautiful crab spider in the middle is also an oak specialist found mostly on coast live oak. And these types of activities could also benefit people. So as Robin mentioned, these are coast live oak and valley oak are both drought tolerant. Coast live oak in particular is really good at intercepting rainfall because it has a canopy that persists during the winter. They produce a lot of dense shade, and they store a lot of carbon, and they're part of our natural heritage. And so I'm going to conclude with just one very brief slide on the carbon sequestration piece. So what we did was to use the Cal Fire's carbon calculator to calculate the carbon sequestration potential of the 10 most common trees compared to coast live oak in the Silicon Valley urban forest. And what we found was that coast live oak comes in first if you look across, if you look at total carbon storage over the 45-year lifespan, typical lifespan of a street tree. It's followed closely by redwood, but everything else is much less. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin to talk about next steps.
Thanks. That there's a powerful idea here to draw on the natural heritage of our region, of our state, to creatively create the more resilient landscapes of the future. It would add resilience both for the ecosystem and for human communities. So while kind of building sense of place and drawing on the heritage of the region. But we're kind of early in this big idea. So we have this report that will come out that we'll share with you in a couple weeks. As you see, dives into the science of it, the ecology, and how you would approach this concept to actually be able to say this is going to make a positive difference to the ecosystem. So we're not just sort of throwing trees in randomly. We're actually trying to do urban forestry or planting in agricultural settings from an ecological basis, which is a lot of sort of the transition we need to make in the future in general, right? With our water systems and our ecosystems or our flood protection systems. So this is applying that to these other settings. So we have some of an ecological basis, but it's not yet a how-to or a plan or a strategy. So I want to note that I think people may expect to pick this up and they're like, okay, well, what should we do in Nevada? Or what should we do in Napa? It's not quite there yet. We need to take the science and translate it into regional application in real places. And how does that play out through programs? Through an urban forestry program or through a voluntary vineyard, installation of trees, which also then provides shade for workers. So we need to make those bridges. So that's what I think is the next step. And we're really interested in working with partners here. We started talking with RCD, Friends of Napa River, and Sonoma RCD a little bit. We'd love to develop a partnership to maybe explore this idea further and start to make it more real in the North Bay. One aspect of that would obviously be we focused because there was interest in Silicon Valley from Google and some nonprofits and the water district to kind of get this idea rolling there, but that is much more urban, so you can see our thinking is more well developed for urban settings, but it could be applied to agricultural, rural, and you also do have different settings. So the neat thing about the North Bay would be about the combination of the more diverse, heterogeneous landscape. How does that fit together? So, so the idea to put out, maybe can be discussed briefly here, or maybe takes hold over the next few months, would be, is there a collaborative project among a few partners here that could apply the science to make a local plan and actually start moving towards implementation? So I think that would look something like this, a re-oaking vision for a particular landscape or setting, and it would help you identify what are the right sites. You can't plant oaks everywhere, right? There's a whole set of challenges, right? They're big trees, there's all the concerns, and we talk about this a bit in the report, but there's maintenance, there's tree roots, there's all the concerns that come up. There's some places are good for shade in the summer, some places you need to keep sun. So like we have seen in Napa, it works better if the oaks are on the south side of the road, so the shade ends up mostly on the road where you're driving and you want to keep things cool, and not so much on the vineyard on the other side. So I think there's smart things, but that would take conversations with the experts on those topics, right? The vineyard managers. And we've started many of these conversations already. What are the densities and the connectivities in a particular setting? Where are the key spots to focus on first? And how many and where? Looking at the landscape and sort of the opportunities it provides, the partnerships that are there. And then it's not just oaks, as Erica pointed out, it's variety of oaks, it's other trees, it's greenery trees for certain species. It's, you got to think about the life cycle of these species. So, and there's great work to build on. I'm really proud and impressed with the work that Napa RCD and Friends of Napa River have done. We started the reoaking idea largely in Napa, and they've carried it forward and developed a really neat program on reoaking that has an educational component, a community-based component, an online mapping tool. So we actually, in different spots, have pulled together. We realized a lot of the elements of a fairly strong programmatic approach to this topic. We just haven't really put all the pieces together yet in the same place. But there are plenty of examples too as we look out there. This oak at Trefethen, to the point, this is my point on the southern side of the farm road, mostly covering, this is I call linear oak savanna. It's got a nice mix age. It's got old trees, young trees, there are acorn woodpeckers in the canopy. It's linear. It's shading the vines a little bit, but mostly just the road. Then in the cities, there's plenty of spots once you start looking around. So thank you much for your time.